Good morning, everyone. Might as well turn over to the book of Ruth. I think that's where we're going to spend most of our morning today. It's in the book of Ruth. Of course, we are continuing our study of those that are listed in the genealogy of Christ, as we see in Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3. Last week, we talked about the descendants from Judah: Perez, Hezron, Ram, Amminadab, Nahshon, and Salmon. And some, well, they don't have a lot to say about them, but some had some interesting details. I think we all learned a little bit going through that selection of guys. And now, today, we are going to, I intend to spend pretty much all day talking about Boaz. Boaz is a major figure in the book of Ruth. We actually get quite a bit of detail about him, his kind of character, what he does. So it's not going to be just little tidbits. There's actually a narrative here that involves him quite heavily. Before we get into the book itself, and I know that this book is oftentimes used as a study for women's classes. It's often a major popular focus. I think that's great. But I would also say, and this may be me on my opinion box, saying if you want to teach a young man how to be a man, look at Boaz here in this story, because he does pretty much everything right. I can't find any fault in this guy. He's respectful. He treats his workers well. They respect him in return. He's a very respectable man. He's a rule follower. He's very merciful. He cares about what people do rather than the circumstances of where they're coming from. We see some of that in his interactions with Ruth. He's great. This is a man's man. This is a really great example, I think, for young men to follow. And since we're focusing on the lineage of Jesus here and the men who are in it, I'm going to be sort of doing an abridged study, I guess, of Ruth, just because you can't really separate him completely from the situation of the book. But know that I'm really going to focus more on Boaz than Ruth or Naomi. But we will have to kind of talk about the situation a little bit. So we'll probably get more than just Boaz here, but that's going to be my main focus here. I think there's plenty to talk about just looking at Boaz himself. So Ruth is really short. It's only 4 chapters long. And Boaz is not mentioned at all in the first chapter. He's not involved in the situation in the first chapter. The first chapter really just gives us the setup for Ruth and her involvement with Boaz and how she comes to be part of Naomi's kind of group here. So this takes place during the time of the judges. We're informed of that in the very first verse of this book. And I haven't bothered to try to calculate like which judge was around at this time, or was there even a judge around at this time during this era. That'd be a little bit more work on my end. I didn't do that, but if you're interested in that, go ahead. So we're introduced to Elimelech. I'm not sure how to say that name exactly. And Naomi from Bethlehem in Judah. I'm going to bring this up before I keep going. It's interesting how a lot of this is taking place in Bethlehem. Again, not a coincidence here when you figure out the lineage here. We'll maybe talk about that a little bit more, but just kind of note that. They leave Judah and they go to Moab because there's a famine going on. We see this talked about in the first couple verses. And they leave with their sons. They have their sons, 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And while they're in Moab, their sons marry Moabite women. One is named Orpah, and the other one is Ruth, who, of course, is what this book is named after. Now, in the course of the time while they're in Moab, Naomi's husband dies, and then her 2 sons also die. So she is a widow. She has her 2 daughters-in-law. Me and Bethany debated if it was daughters-in-law or daughter-in-laws. I think it's daughters-in-law is the right way to say that. And that's it. And she gets to the point where there's food. The famine in Israel is over, and she's going back, and her daughters-in-law are going with her. But as we see it's verses kind of 6 through 19, she has this conversation with them, and Naomi tries to tell them both, go back. I don't have any sons for you. There's nothing for you here. You'll be going to a foreign land. It's not your land. Go back to your houses. of your family, and go find yourselves other husbands. And Orpah eventually does turn around and return to Moab, but Ruth insists on staying with Naomi, going back with her, and eventually Naomi relents, she allows it, and they arrive back in Bethlehem as the barley harvest is beginning, which we see that in verses 19 through 22. So again, Bethlehem is going to be kind of the central area here that this book is taking place in, and the barley harvest is beginning, and that's sort of important to the events of the story, even if it's not very interesting. A lot of the stuff that Ruth goes on to do would not happen if it wasn't harvest time. So that's a nice kind of note for us as we go through the story. But again, Boaz not mentioned here, but that's the setup. Any thoughts, comments before we get into chapter 2 and talking about Boaz and how he plays into this story? Okay, great. I'm also going to note, if we get through this and we have a lot of time left, that's going to be your guys' fault, because I think there's a lot for us to talk about here. So let's talk about chapter 2. And this is when we're introduced to Boaz. The very first verse, it actually just mentions Boaz and then kind of goes back, and then he comes back into the picture here. But I think they bring him up here in the first verse to kind of give you a little bit of background on why this guy is kind of important. So Boaz, we see his connection to Naomi. He's a relative of her husband's side, and he's a man of standing. And so, he's a good guy, and he's a relative. So that's basically all we need to know about him at this point, that he's a man of standing and he's a relative. So we'll get more into that in just a second. But we have Ruth in verses 2 and 3. She goes out to glean in a field behind the harvesters. This is to sustain herself and Naomi with food. And it just so happens that she wanders into the field of Boaz. And it seems like she didn't mean to. This was not something she did on purpose. It might have been, one of the closest ones, or maybe looked like it was one of the best ones to go to. Whatever the reason, that's why she went there. But it doesn't seem that she knew anything about Boaz or the connection to Boaz at that point. And I want to talk about this idea of the gleaning of the harvest. This is mentioned in the Old Testament, in the Old Law, rather, in Leviticus chapter 19, verses 9 through 10, and also in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 19 and 21. We won't go to those sections for the sake of time, but basically, when the harvesters were going through getting the harvest, they were not to go back and see, is there anything we missed, or let's go back through a second time just to make sure we actually got everything. God told them to leave that behind for those that were poor, who didn't have anything, so that they could go through after the harvesters, pick up what little bit was left so they would have some food for themselves. Call it a social security net of some kind, I guess, in very early times. So they were supposed to go through, the poor could come through and glean whatever was left over. In fact, they were told also not to go to the very end corners of the field. They were supposed to round it off so that there would be every time at least some food for those who were not able to get food on their own. And it seems like that's what's happening here. Is Ruth is going out, and she is, like the Old Law mentioned, going out and gleaning after the harvesters. Now we see Boaz arrive to the field from Bethlehem. He greets his workers. They kind of give him this blessing in return. It's like, he's like, hey, the Lord be with you. And they're like, hey, boss, the Lord bless you. And that sounds like a really good boss relationship with his employees. You don't get that very often. So that kind of shows you a little bit about how well he's regarded. Is he greets his workers, they happily greet him back. And it's very wholesome, very positive. Little tidbits like that really go a long way. And then Boaz notices Ruth, and he asks about her. This is in verses 5 through 7. He asks about her, and he's told that, this is Ruth. This is the daughter-in-law of Naomi. She came back from Moab with her, and she's been diligently gleaning in the field pretty much the whole time. She took one little break, and she's been on it the whole time. And she even asked permission to do so, which under the Old Law, they should have just been allowed to do it no matter what, but she even asked about it just to make sure it'd be okay. And there is a section here in chapter 2. I want to read kind of the rest of this, if someone would be helpful to us, because this is Boaz's first direct interaction with Ruth, starting in verse 8. Someone read for us verses 8 through 17, please. I know it's a little long, but I want to go through and read that. Someone read verses 8 through 17, please.
So Boaz said to Ruth, don't embarrass her. Rather, pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah.
Okay. So I really like this interaction with Boaz and Ruth. And again, I'm focusing more on Boaz. Obviously, Ruth has an important role here, but Boaz is really doing some incredible character work here. She asks him, and this is in verse 10, she asks him, why are you being so nice to me? In essence, that's the simple way. Why are you being so nice to me? I'm a foreigner. I'm a Moabite. You don't have any, I mean nothing to you and your people. And, he says, in essence, that doesn't matter. I've heard of what you've done. And what a great respective character where Boaz is not only letting her go ahead and be in his field and glean from the harvest, but he's kind of watching out for her. He's telling his men, don't bother her, don't touch her, leave her alone. In fact, make sure you leave a little bit extra for her behind so that she actually has enough to sustain both herself and Naomi. Because he might have some really good workers, and maybe they're really efficient. They get that harvest in. There may not be that much left over, so he makes sure that she's going to be provided for. 'Cause she's working. She may not be one of the hired harvesters, but she's out in that field too. She's trying to get food too, and he recognizes the hard work she's trying to do, not just for herself, but also for Naomi. Naomi is not out there with her, so she's trying to feed two people, and he recognizes that. And he is making sure she's protected. He gives her a little extra special treatment because he knows that she's a respectable person. Is she a Moabite? Yeah, but she's doing the right things. And so he regards that very highly. And I think this is just an excellent interaction that they have. Comments, questions about those set of verses we had read? Jeff, go ahead. And I would say, adding on to that, Ruth is, I wouldn't say she's just taking the high road in this. She's taking the higher road, even more so. Because she could have turned around like Oprah did, or Orpah did. I'm going to always mess that up. Because did she do anything wrong going back to Moab? Not really. That was the instruction Naomi gave her, and everyone would understand, she's got to, find a husband and have a family and take care of herself. But, Ruth is going above and beyond. This is obviously well known among the community. Boaz mentions that he's heard about this, And he's never talked to her before, as far as we know. This is the first interaction that we have recorded between them. But he's heard about her. He knows, like, oh, this is the Moabite that came back from Moab with Naomi and is trying to take care of her. And he has a great respect for that. And they'll talk more about that. And it's just good for someone seeing someone doing something selfless and is kind of trying to pay that forward, to be like, that person needs to get something for what they're doing.
One more thing about Ruth. Why is Ruth so so determined to take care of her mother-in-law? And I think of three reasons off the top of my head. One is she may see the superior belief system of Naomi over, Moloch, or whatever the different gods of the Moabites. Number two, Naomi may have been someone to really look up to. We don't know a whole lot about Naomi. She does all the right things, but we don't get a lot of in-depth information about her.
Yeah, she's not really the main character, if you would.
And thirdly, she just wanted to do what's right. And those are three powerful things that need to be in us. We need to appreciate the superior way of God, obviously. We need to appreciate the good in others, and we need to always strive to do the right thing. Those are three powerful motivations to land you in the right place.
I think your first one probably has at least the most evidence we see in Scripture here. Go back to the first chapter. This is when Ruth is, saying why she's not going to leave Naomi. This is in verse 16. It says, "But Ruth replied, 'Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God.'" She is openly saying that, as you're saying, your belief system, the Lord God that you are serving, that's who I want to serve. That's what I want to be a part of. Which is not typically the pattern we see in the Old Testament. There was over and over warnings about marrying the foreign women of the land of Canaan, because what were they going to bring with them? Their gods. They were going to bring in these idols. And we've talked many times about this, the examples in which that has happened. But here's an exception here where a foreign Moabite has decided, no, I don't want to bring those gods with me. I want to be part of this that the Israelites have. I want to be part of a service to their God. So I think, Jeff, your first point definitely has grounding in Scripture there. She is determined not just to serve Naomi, but to be a part of the service that they are doing to God. So I think, and again, I'm kind of overlooking some of these details because I'm trying to focus more on Boaz here, but that's obviously a good thing to bring up. So, go ahead.
I have always thought that she went to Boaz's field from like a providence of God. And when she stated, "Your God will be my God," in the New Testament we're told that anybody who leaves their home, their mother, their father, I will take care of them. So I believe that that's what happened with Ruth.
Yeah, and we see similar parallel examples. I mean, Abraham is another example. We studied him not too long ago. His father, Terah, that whole household, they left Ur of the Chaldees. And they could have gone back. And Hebrews tells us that. They could have gone back at any time, but he chose to follow God instead. And it's one of those, like, it'd be a very interesting what-if situation. Well, what if Abraham stayed in Ur? What if he went back to Ur? What would have happened? We can never really know the answer to that, but sometimes it's a good, healthy exercise to think about, well, things probably wouldn't have worked out the way they did, obviously. That promise may not have gone through Abraham at that point, but Abraham's faith was greater than, his comfort with his people, if you will, being around those he knew. He was a stranger in a foreign land, just as Ruth is in this case. But they were determined to follow the Lord. And I think, obviously, Ruth's going to Boaz's field, it's got to be providence of God. What are the odds? I mean, I guess Bethlehem's not a huge city, but still, what are the odds? It's pretty small.
And Boaz was rewarded as well the rest of his life, and to become someone in the lineage
Yeah, you're getting ahead of me, though. Well, no, that's definitely a good point. We'll talk about that quite a bit when we talk about chapter 4, because it's very obvious what becomes of this. And both of them really doing the right things, and then the benefit that they're going to get from that, and how that's going to affect, well, the genealogy to Christ. Yeah, very good. Any other things on chapter 2? Or actually, no, there's one more. I do want to read some more of this, actually, before I get off track here. If someone to read verse 18 of chapter 2 through 23, there's actually a couple things I want to say about this. Verse 18 through 23, which is the end of the chapter, please.
Then she took up and went to the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. So she brought it out and gave to her what she had kept back after she had been satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where have you gleaned today? And where did you work? Blessed be the one who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, "The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "Blessed be he of the Lord, who has not forsaken his kindness to the living and the dead." And Naomi said to her, "The man is a relative of yours, one of our near kinsmen." Then Ruth the Moabitess said, "He also said to me, 'You shall stay close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.'" And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, and that the people do not meet you in any other field." So she stayed close by the young woman of Boaz to glean until the end of barley harvest and wheat harvest, and she dwelt with her mother-in-law.
Okay, so Naomi asked, like, "Hey, you've got way too much here. Where did you go? What have you been doing?" And then she is told that, "Oh yeah, I was working in the field of Boaz," and Naomi recognizes this name, and she's like, "Oh yes, this is one of our close relatives." Some of your translations, the end of verse 20, will say he is one of our kinsman redeemers, and that's something I'm going to touch on here in verse, or when we get kind of more later on. I'll talk about more of that. But she recognizes this is a good situation. Let's continue on, continue in his field, keep working in his field. We've already talked about Boaz was interested in protecting her. It seems that Naomi says, it's good for you to be in his field. He's going to kind of look out for you. Otherwise, you go somewhere else. I mean, you're kind of vulnerable. No one's going to be out there to protect you necessarily. So she says, keep going back there. And Naomi is so thankful. Boaz, he could have, just blew us off. We're nobodies anymore. We're a liability, if you will. And now he's looking out for Ruth, and she's so thankful for that. And she tells, the Lord bless him. He's doing the right thing. He's doing good stuff. So it speaks more to Boaz's character here when Naomi recognizes him and says, "Oh, he's doing great. Keep going there. This is a great situation." Any other comments on chapter 2?
Several times, at least twice, maybe 3 times now, it's mentioned the fact that she is not just gleaning in the field with the poor people. She is among Boaz's maidens as they glean. So it seems to me that a harvester had, I'm struggling for really words here, dedicated women that would work in his fields along with the men. And there may be 2 stages of gathering the harvest. The men are in the wagons, the men are cutting, maybe the women are gathering up off the ground, even the initial gathering. The men cut, the women gather. In any case, it is a way that gives her access to more grain than if she went with all the other poor people. So it's like a promotion. He elevates her to a higher place, which guarantees she'll be able to get as much grain as she and Naomi need. In addition, when he says don't go to any other field, Boaz is looking out for her safety. Recognize that this is during the times of Judges, and you had these cyclical periods in which people were not good people. There were very immoral, very many immoral people among the people. And so she would be in danger as a stranger going to these other fields. There may be a man who takes advantage of her, or a
Yeah, and,
really powerful thing that Boaz does. He,
and Naomi recognizes that too.
yes, he
Yeah.
is an exemplary person thinking of other people.
And in addition to, kind of just mentioning the time period, the time of the Judges, where, I mean, it talks about people did what was right in their own eyes. That's the description of the era of the Judges. People did what was right in their own eyes. There's no central figure, saying, this is the rules and I'm going to enforce this. It's people doing like, hey, I think this is what I want to do. I'm going to do it this way. That's basically the description we get. And by the time you get to the end of the Judges, you have cities in the tribe of Benjamin that are not unlike those in Sodom and Gomorrah. So I won't get too much into that story. That's another whole study for itself. But in addition to that, she's not an Israelite. She's a foreigner. Who is going to stick up for her, in any kind of case or issue that she has? Nobody of the city, would say, well, I'm going to stick up for her. She's not one of theirs. I mean, you might have Naomi would be the only one, but she's not really in a place of much persuasion either. She's a widow. She's been gone. So they're kind of on their own. So it could be a very dangerous situation to be in, absolutely. Any other thoughts? Okay, let's get into chapter 3. And I want to talk more about the kinsman redeemer. I think before we continue on, we need to talk more about that concept. Leviticus chapter 25 is probably the best place to go for that. You look at Leviticus chapter 25, verse 5, where you have a poor person who they have to sell, some of their property. A nearest relative could redeem that property. They could buy it back on their behalf. Or if you have a person who, is poor and they've sold themselves into indentured servitude, which is probably, the simplest way to talk about that. This is later on in Leviticus 25, verses 47 through 55. It talks about an uncle or a cousin or another close blood relative could go and redeem them out of that situation, could buy them out of that situation. So this is kind of what we're talking about, is someone who is poor, they've gotten themselves into a situation. It was not really just, an option, but it was sort of the duty of the next closest relative to go and get them out of that situation, go and take care of them, buy their freedom or buy back their property so that they could have a living for their own, so they could continue on. Now, there is more to that in Deuteronomy 25. I'm going to talk about that when we get to chapter 4, though, because it's not yet quite in play. And I want to talk about it when we get to chapter 4. So we can talk about more of the sandal stuff and what that's about. But it's already been mentioned here, and again, some of your translations, when you go to the end of chapter 2, verse 20, it is said of Boaz that he is one of our kinsmen redeemers or close relatives. So Boaz is in this situation where he might be the one to buy them out of their situation or redeem them, if you will, which if you hear the term redeemer and you think of Jesus, yeah, that's the correct way to think about it, because what did Christ do for us? He bought us out of our situation. I mean, we were doomed to a certain existence and a certain future because of our sin. He buys us out of that with his blood. That is it's not like a coincidence that term is used that way, because that's literally what Jesus is doing. And the prophets speak to that, God buying back his people. The book of Hosea kind of makes a parallel for this, buying back his wife, redeeming her for a price. There's a strong parallel to that. So if that word makes you think of Jesus, good, because that's the kind of thing we're talking about here, is pulling someone out of a doomed position. So that would be something that Boaz could do. So as we said, Naomi believes that Boaz can fulfill this role, and we see this in chapter 3 in even more detail. Verses 1 through 6, she sends Ruth to go basically make an appeal to him, is go to him. He's going to be alone after, when they're on the threshing floor, because they've been winnowing the barley. Go to him and make an appeal to him. That's what's going on. Some people kind of look at this and say, it seems like they're trying to seduce Boaz in this situation. That's not what's going on. This is a heartfelt appeal from Naomi through Ruth saying, please help us. Please redeem us. And we're going to see how Boaz reacts to that. When you get to verse 9, he wakes up, he sees Ruth, and they talk. And she says in verse 9, I'm your servant Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer, or you are a close relative. He understands this gesture. She's asking for help. She's asking for him to basically redeem them. And he says, the Lord bless you. This is great. And he even mentions this interesting thing at the end of verse 10. You haven't run after younger men, which implies to me that Boaz is maybe not the youngest guy. Now, we're not told his age, I don't think, anywhere, but he's probably past his prime. He's probably an older man, but he recognizes this. He understands what she's wanting to do. And then in verse 11, he basically is accepting this responsibility. He's like, okay, yeah, I'm the kinsman redeemer. I can do this. He even recognizes her noble character. He is willing to do this. And then you get to verse 12. There's a little bit of an issue here. He wants to do it. He has no problem doing it. This would be great, except verse 12, he mentions, there's another kinsman redeemer that's a closer relative than I. And this kinsman redeemer, he's never named this other closer relative. I wonder if this is like to the shame of that person because they didn't end up redeeming Ruth. But that person's never mentioned by name. That's my assumption, is why they're never mentioned by name. So he says, if that relative wants to redeem, it's his duty, it's his right to do so first. He gets priority. So even though Boaz would want to do this, he has no problem doing it. He recognizes Ruth and her character. He says, there's a problem here. I've got to go to this relative first. They are the next in line. They have the first right to redeem. But he says, if he's not going to do it, if he's not willing to redeem, then I'm going to do it. So he gives her a promise. She's not going to be left out in the cold, if you will. If he doesn't do it, then I will do it. Someone's going to take care of you, is basically his reassurance. And then before this chapter ends, he even sends her away with some food. She's not going away empty-handed, so he's got a very kind gesture there. And if you imagine the other kinsman redeemer is the closer relative, if he redeems her, well, he's just lost a bunch of food for no reason. But that doesn't seem to be his issue. He's not worried about that. He wants to make sure they're taken care of. And we get to, sort of the end of the chapter. Naomi and Ruth, they talk about what's going on, what's going to happen. And I think Naomi, again, speaks to Boaz's character. Not only does he not leave Ruth empty-handed, but Ruth says at verse 18, which is the last verse of that chapter, she says, wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today. So she has some insight into Boaz's character. He's not going to wait on this. He's not going to let it kind of dwell. He's going to take care of it right away. Sometimes there's something really important that we need done, or someone else needs done. We need to do for someone else, and we're like, well, this isn't as important as I think it is. I'll take my time. I've got some time. I'll wait till later to do it. Sometimes that becomes a problem later, and you're like, well, I thought I had time, and no, I don't, or something else comes up, and maybe the situation gets worse or changes. But Boaz is going to take care of it right then and there. He's not going to wait on it, even though no one would necessarily fault him for it. He's going to make sure this is done. Again, Boaz, man of great character. Anything on chapter 3 we need to mention about Boaz or the situation he's in? Okay, I'm going to attempt to finish chapter 4 in like 3 minutes. So here we go. So Boaz, lo and behold, first thing, he goes to the close relative, again unnamed. He gathers the elders of the town. He speaks to them of the issue of redeeming the land of Naomi's husband. And when he's talking about that in the first 4 verses, that unnamed closer relative says, yeah, I'll redeem it, speaking of the land. But then Boaz replies, and this is starting in verse 5, he says, well, if you do that, you're also going to be redeeming Ruth. You're going to have to acquire her in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. And then the closer relative is like, oh, no, I don't want that situation. That's going to be a problem. And so he says, I'm not going to do it. you go ahead and redeem it. He removes his sandal, and this seems like such kind of an odd thing, but we're given a little bit in here in verse 7, where it says, "Now in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the other. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel." But there's a little bit more to this than I think is mentioned here in verse 7. You go to Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 10. It talks about the duty of the brothers, basically. And this is sort of the situation we saw in Genesis, I think it was 38 with Judah and Tamar, where he had a brother who was married, and he dies, and his wife is left widowed and without children. The next in line, the brother was supposed to go and have children with her so that his name would endure. The child would basically be his older brother's child. That's how that would go. And I think that's a lot of what's kind of going on here is, you were supposed to do this duty, you didn't do it. In fact, I think it's in verse 10 of Deuteronomy 25. It says, "The person that does not do this will be known as the family of the unsandaled," or something to that effect. Sort of an insult to them. Like, you didn't do your duty, you didn't do what you were supposed to do. And in this case, this nearest close relative, he's not doing the redemption. This is his primary duty. He says, "I can't do it." He's taking off his sandal. Maybe this is why he's not named. He's of the family of the unsandaled. He gives it to Boaz. Now Boaz is going to take this and he's going to redeem them. So the elders, the people, are witnesses to this. This is talked about in verses 9 and 10, that he is going to take up the property of Naomi's husband and also will take on Ruth the Moabite to be his wife. In verse 11 and 12, the elders and people praise Boaz for this. So he's already a good man of standing, as we've been told before, but they praise him even more. They say, in this, we hope you build a large family like the wives of Jacob. We hope that you have great standing in Bethlehem and will be famous in Bethlehem, which he's going to be because he's going to have some descendants that are pretty important. And then they also say, may your family be like that of Perez, son of Judah and Tamar, which is his ancestor. I mean, we can draw the line. We've just talked about them. So they're hoping, good blessings upon you in this union. So everyone seems to be really happy about this situation, except maybe that other close relative who lost a sandal. So then we have Boaz and Ruth. They're married. They have a son named Obed. This is in verses 13 through 17. And we're given here kind of a brief genealogy, verses 17 through 22 at the very end here, where we have the line from Perez to David. So, of course, Perez was the son of... Yes, all right. Someone was paying attention. So we have Judah, Perez, then we have listed Hezron, Ram, Amminadab, Nahshon, Salmon, all these people we've talked about last week. So hopefully that's fresh on the mind. Then Boaz, and then his son Obed, who was born to him through Ruth. Then Jesse, then David. So, and I think I've mentioned this before, this means that David's great-grandmother was a Moabite. So when people wonder about certain lineages and stuff, the Gentiles were not completely excluded from this. In fact, we can speak more about that in probably a little bit later. But so we have David mentioned here, and I believe this is the first time David is mentioned in the Bible, first time chronologically. Now, at this point in the book of Ruth, he hasn't been born yet, but it kind of lets us know, like, hey, this person's going to come from this. Now, if you were reading through the Bible first time, didn't know anything about this, you'd get to this and you'd be like, okay, Obed, okay, that's the son of Boaz, and his grandson Jesse, his great-grandson David. Okay, like, that wouldn't mean anything to you. But then you keep reading, you go through 1 Samuel, and this David guy, son of Jesse, shows up again, and you're like, oh yeah, I remember this. Like, they had a good ancestor, Boaz. And, that makes that connection, and suddenly things start, they click a little bit. So, sometimes we're not used, and this is different for everybody. When people read through the Bible for the first time, sometimes they're encouraged, don't read from Genesis to Revelation, start somewhere else and read a little bit here, then go back, read here. But if you were going through it as it was chronologically kind of put together here, you'd be making some of these connections as you're reading. So I think that's really interesting. All right, I think that's most of what I have to say. We're a little bit out of time, but I'll take any final comments or anything. Go ahead, Jeff.
We talked about the fact of how your ancestors and their choices morally can affect you as far as those that you know, at least. But also other choices that they make. But so now that Ruth is through Boaz, Ruth is David's ancestor. David might have a different view about strangers or foreigners or immigrants or whatever. And so it's just another unique way in which our family relations affect us, hopefully in a good way. And always we need to pattern the good works and, not pattern the bad works, but still.
Yeah, and speaking to David and his connection to Moab specifically, I think I'm recalling this correctly off the top of my head. When David is on the run at some point, I think he takes some of his family to the king of Moab for refuge. So that seems like a random thing. Like, why would you go to Moab? But he does have some ancestral connection there. It's a bit distant. Another one I want to mention, and I think I did not mention this when we were talking about Salmon, and this is probably something I should have mentioned. I neglected to. When you go to Matthew chapter 1, verse 5, Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. So Rahab was not an Israelite either. And in fact, she was a prostitute. And people would look at her and say, like, well, why is she in the lineage of Christ? Because she did the same thing that Ruth did. She decided, I don't want to be part of this anymore. I want to serve the one true and living God. And we see, in the Battle of Jericho, she and her family are spared. They're the only ones spared in that conflict. And, she becomes part of the lineage of Christ also. I can't believe I neglected to mention that last week, but it's not that God didn't care about the Gentiles. It's that most of the time the Gentiles were not interested in serving the Lord. So, but we have these women that we get mentioned here, sprinkled in this genealogy, who decided, I don't want to be part of whatever thing my nation has been doing. I recognize the one true and living God, and I want to be part of that. So, kudos to both of them. Any other comments before we close? Okay. All right. Great we got through all that. There's a lot to say. But again, Boaz, great example. Next week, we'll talk about Obed and Jesse. I have a little bit to say on them, so it won't be super quick. But then after that, of course, we're going to get to David. We might spend a bit of time on David while not trying to trample on Jeff's study on Wednesday nights. So that'll be difficult to do. But those will be the next three in the order. So that's what we'll start up next week. Thank you.